Welcome to the Neurokrish Immersion. Today we're discussing being FOMO, the neuroscience of love, attachment, and belonging. There's a Labrador in our home called Sakura. She is by every conventional measure a perfectly healthy dog. She eats enthusiastically, sleeps comfortably, greets every morning with boundless optimism, and regards every meal as one of life's great celebrations. She has never read a psychology textbook. She has certainly never heard the term fear of missing out. Yet, if ever there was a creature who embodied it, it is Sakura. If I am at home, I rarely move through the apartment alone. The moment I stand up from my chair, another pair of feet quietly rises from the floor. If I leave my study and walk towards the kitchen, she follows. If I wander into another room looking for a book, she follows. If I step onto the balcony for a few moments of quiet, she follows. It's not done with excitement or urgency. It's simply accepted as the natural order of things. Where Dad goes, Sakura goes. Not because she doubts that I shall return, but because she cannot imagine why anything interesting should happen without her. Visitors soon discover another dimension of this remarkable temperament. She welcomes them warmly. Labradors, as we all know, possess an extraordinary generosity of spirit. Everyone is greeted as though they have been expected for years. Yet, there are boundaries that visitors gradually learn to respect. One may converse with Dad, one may sit beside Dad, one may even, for a while, receive Dad's attention. But prolonged cuddles are another matter entirely. For a few minutes, Sakura tolerates the arrangement with remarkable restraint. Then comes the unmistakable, indignant bark. Not an angry bark, not a threatening bark. An indignant bark, as though to point out that a small but important error has crept into the emotional order of the household. She then appears, gently but decisively, inserting herself between Dad and the offending human, or indeed, occasionally, Kaiser, our Rottweiler, until what she considers the proper balance has been restored. Her attachment extends beyond people to the entire rhythm of family life. The opening of the refrigerator, the clatter of a plate, a whispered conversation in another room, a cupboard door opening, a paper bag that sounds suspiciously as though it might contain food, the simple act of someone standing up unexpectedly. Nothing escapes her notice. It would be tempting to conclude that Labradors are simply obsessed with food. Indeed, I recently saw a popular science paper which talked about a genetic anomaly which made them vulnerable to this. Certainly, Sakura would do little to discourage that impression. But the longer I have watched her, the less convinced I have become that food is really the point. Meals are social occasions. Preparation is participation. And if something is happening, Sakura wishes to be part of it. Nothing important should unfold beyond the horizon of her awareness. And then, of course, there is Kaiser, who has been the subject of our podcast before. Kaiser is our Rottweiler. If you've not heard about him before, please listen to the Resilient Brain podcast. Larger, older, and altogether more philosophical, Kaiser is our Rottweiler. Larger, older, and altogether more philosophical, he regards the world with a calm confidence that I have often envied. Every now and then, however, Kaiser makes what Sakura considers a serious misjudgment. He wanders over to me seeking affection. For Sakura, this is not a confrontation. It is a misunderstanding. An indignant bark announces her opinion. She quietly but firmly inserts herself between us, restoring what she believes to be the proper emotional geometry of the household. It is difficult to feel offended. She is not possessive in any mean-spirited sense. She is simply convinced that love is best experienced together and preferably with herself at the center of the arrangement. Nighttime provides perhaps the most touching ritual of all. Like many dogs, Sakura begins the night obediently enough at the foot of the bed. But sometime during the small hours, she embarks upon a slow and almost imperceptible migration. By dawn, she has usually arrived beside my pillow, and there, with extraordinary gentleness, she licks my head. Just once, perhaps twice, enough to reassure herself. I have often wondered what question lies hidden within that simple gesture. It's probably not, "Are you awake?" More likely it is, "You're still here, aren't you?" Satisfied by the answer, she curls up once more and returns to sleep. Over the years, I have found myself smiling at these small rituals. At first, they seemed merely amusing. Then, they became endearing. More recently, they have become something else entirely. They have made me curious. Why does one Labrador organize her entire day around the movements of another living being? Why does the simple act of leaving a room become worthy of investigation? Why does another dog living in the same home and loving the same family behave so very differently? Those questions have taken me to some unexpected places. Not first to neuroscience, nor to psychology. Oddly enough, they took me back to childhood. Long before I had heard of attachment theory, long before anyone had spoken to me about the social brain, long before neuroscientists began mapping the remarkable networks through which we understand one another today, I already knew Snowy. I already knew Tigger. I already knew Piglet. I already knew poor Cacophonics. Perhaps, without realizing it, my earliest teachers of temperament had never been scientists at all. They had been storytellers. The curious thing about childhood is that we are often better observers than we are as adults. Children notice differences with extraordinary clarity, yet they rarely feel compelled to judge them. They simply accept that people are different. One child is adventurous, another timid. One never stops talking, while another quietly watches the world unfold. One always wants to lead, and the other is perfectly happy to follow. The differences seem as natural as the colors of flowers in a garden. They are simply part of what makes each friend recognizable and memorable. And then somewhere along the journey into adulthood, something changes. We stop observing and begin evaluating. The adventurous child becomes impulsive. The quiet child becomes withdrawn. The affectionate child becomes clingy. The enthusiastic child becomes attention-seeking. The detached child becomes aloof. The language changes, and with it, perhaps, some of our generosity. Watching Sakura over the years has often transported me back to those childhood books. The first of these companions was probably Snowy. Like so many children of my generation, I traveled the world with Tintin. There were smugglers and spies, hidden treasures and mysterious civilizations, deserts, mountains, and oceans. Yet, beneath every adventure, another story quietly unfolded. Snowy was always there. He did not simply accompany Tintin, he belonged beside him. When Tintin and Snowy were separated for any reason, Snowy's mind seemed to remain organized around one question. Where was Tintin, and how could he find him again? The little white fox terrier may be distracted by a bone or tempted by some passing curiosity, but the attachment endured. his adventures were never really his own. Their meaning came from reunion, from returning to the person around whom his world had been organized. Perhaps nowhere was this emotional truth more beautifully captured than in Tintin in Tibet. Tintin refuses to abandon Chang because he believes his friend is still alive, and Snowy, in turn, refuses to abandon Tintin. Through avalanches, icy cliffs, and impossible landscapes, he keeps going. As children, we never analyzed this. We simply accepted that this was what companionship looked like. Snowy belonged with Tintin, and the story would have felt incomplete without him. And then there was Hundred Acre Wood. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder whether A. Milne quietly understood more about human temperament than many psychology textbooks. Pooh himself seemed wonderfully content with the simple pleasures of life. A pot of honey, an unhurried walk, and the company of friends appeared entirely sufficient for happiness. Piglet, however, was different. Small, thoughtful, and easily frightened, he often discovered that courage arrived not before companionship, but because of it. When uncertainty threatened to overwhelm him, the presence of Pooh made the world navigable again. Piglet's bravery did not require him to stop being Piglet. It grew in the reassuring presence of someone he trusted. As children, we understood that instinctively. We did not see weakness. We saw a small creature becoming braver because he was not alone. And then came Tigger, the perfect counterpoint. Life itself seemed incapable of containing his enthusiasm. Every adventure deserved participation. Every conversation became more exciting simply because he had entered it. And every possibility demanded immediate exploration. Tigger did not appear worried that Pooh might leave him. He was propelled less by attachment anxiety than by irrepressible curiosity. Children laughed because they recognized him instantly. There was almost certainly a Tigger in every classroom. And finally, there was poor Cacophonix, the village bard of Asterix, who possessed complete confidence in one extraordinary belief, that everyone longed to hear him sing. The villagers held rather different opinions. For generations of readers, the closing banquet became part of the ritual of every Asterix story. There would be food, laughter, friendship, and celebration. And while somewhere nearby, Cacophonix usually found himself tied to a convenient tree, prevented for the collective well-being of the village from sharing his latest musical masterpiece. As children, we laughed at the absurdity of it all. Only much later did it begin to notice something else. On those rare occasions when circumstances genuinely called for his music, Cacophonix was delighted. He was not seeking attention merely for the sake of being noticed. He wanted to contribute. He wanted to belong. He wanted his friends to enjoy what he himself loved so deeply. Every child has known what it feels like to wait, just once, for the opportunity to be included. Perhaps that's why these stories have survived for generations. They were never simply adventures. They were gentle observations of human nature. What strikes me most is not only the accuracy with which these authors understood temperament, but the kindness with which they portrayed it. None of the four was ever asked to trade their nature for someone else's. Each remained affectionately exactly who they were. And perhaps that's one of childhood's greatest gifts. It taught us to recognize temperament before we learn to judge it. As adults, we have become extraordinarily good at describing one another. Too often we have forgotten how to simply observe. Watching Sakura has reminded me of that forgotten skill. Perhaps she does not need to be explained quite so quickly. Perhaps she first deserves simply to be watched, curiously, affectionately, and without criticism. Only then are we ready to ask the question that psychologists and neuroscientists have been trying to answer for more than half a century. What is actually happening inside a mind that loves in this way? Why do these stories feel so true? Why does Snowy's quiet devotion to Tintin seem so entirely natural? Why does Piglet's dependence upon Pooh evoke tenderness rather than impatience? Why does Tigger's exuberance make us smile, while Cacophonics leaves us laughing and yet quietly hoping that just once the village might allow him to sing? Long before we encountered psychology or neuroscience, something within us recognized these personalities instinctively. They felt authentic because, in one way or another, we had already met them. They lived in our families, our classrooms, our friendships, and perhaps somewhere within ourselves. If the storytellers of my childhood first taught me to notice temperament, one man spent much of his professional life asking a deceptively simple question: why do certain relationships become so central to our lives that separation from them feels almost unbearable? Why does the presence of one particular person calm us, while their absence unsettles us in ways that reason alone cannot explain? That man was John Bowlby. Trained as a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, Bowlby worked during a period when psychology was largely preoccupied with instinct, unconscious conflict, and internal drives. Yet his attention was drawn towards something so ordinary that many had scarcely regarded it as a subject worthy of scientific inquiry. He watched children. He watched parents. He observed the extraordinary distress that followed separation, and the equally remarkable transformation that occurred when child and caregiver were reunited. Out of those simple observations emerged one of the most influential ideas in modern psychology. Bowlby realized that the infant is not merely seeking food, warmth, or physical protection. The infant is seeking a person. That insight appears almost self-evident today, but only because Bowlby taught us to see it. Evolution had solved one of the greatest challenges, not simply by creating a larger and more intelligent brain, but by creating a brain capable of becoming deeply attached to another human being. Our earliest survival strategy was not independence. It was relationship, much like Piglet. Before we could walk, before we could speak, and before we could think abstractedly, we had already learned the most important lesson of mammalian life. Safety is found not in isolation, but in the presence of those who care for us. Looking back, one cannot help but admire the elegance of Bowlby's thinking. Great scientific ideas rarely complicate the world. More often, they reveal the extraordinary hidden within the ordinary. Before Bowlby, attachment was largely taken for granted. After Bowlby, it became impossible to ignore. He reminded us that the human mind cannot be understood in isolation from the relationships within which it develops. Among Bowlby's many contributions, there is one phrase that has always fascinated me. He spoke of the child gradually constructing what he called an internal working model. At first glance, it sounds rather mechanical, almost as though he were describing an engineering diagram rather than the deepest of human relationships. Yet, hidden within those three words lies one of the most beautiful ideas in psychology. Each of us slowly constructs an invisible representation of the people who matter. Without ever consciously deciding to do so, the brain begins to learn who notices when we cry, who comforts us when we are frightened, who celebrates our successes, who comes looking when we disappear, and whose presence somehow allows the world to feel predictable once more. These countless moments are quietly woven together into an internal landscape that accompanies us throughout life. We carry within us not merely memories of people, but living expectations of them. For many decades, this remained primarily a psychological insight. Neuroscience has since begun revealing the remarkable biological architecture that allows such inner worlds to exist. Modern neuroscientists no longer search for a single attachment center hidden somewhere deep within the brain. Relationships emerge from the continuous conversation of an entire network. Different regions recognize familiar faces, remember previous encounters, detect emotional significance, and imagine what another person may be thinking or feeling. Together, they allow one human mind to carry within it a living representation of another. This distributed architecture is often described as the social cognitive network. I often find myself thinking of it not simply as a network, but as an inner mandala. Around its outer edges lie acquaintances whose paths briefly cross our own. Closer to the center are friends, colleagues, and neighbors. Deeper still are our parents, children, partners, teachers, and the handful of lifelong companions whose presence quietly shapes the person we become. Every now and then, much to the amusement of my family, this hidden architecture reveals itself in everyday life. I occasionally find myself calling one of my children Kaiser. The laughter is immediate and entirely justified. Yet, perhaps my brain is just revealing something rather more interesting than a simple lapse of memory. It is not confusing a child with a dog. It is briefly retrieving the wrong name from the same circle of attachment. Let me repeat that. When I call a child by the name of a dog, it's not confusing a child with a dog. It is briefly retrieving the wrong name from the same circle of attachment. Such slips are remarkably common. We rarely confuse complete strangers. We confuse those who occupy neighboring places within our inner social world. The brain appears to organize people not alphabetically but relationally. It first identifies the emotional neighborhood. Only afterwards does it retrieve the individual. Occasionally, another much loved occupant of the same neighborhood arrives first. The mistake tells us rather less about memory than it does about relationship. Seen through this lens, Sakura begins to make rather more sense. Perhaps she is not simply following dad from room to room. Perhaps she is tending her inner mandala. Every time I leave my study, her brain updates its living representation of the world. Dad has moved. The center of the mandala has shifted. The picture is momentarily incomplete until she quietly pads across the apartment and settles once more beside me. Watching Sakura, I sometimes wonder whether what appears to be the simplest of canine behaviors is in fact one of evolution's greatest triumphs. A brain that not only recognizes another living being, but gradually reorganizes itself around that relationship. Perhaps that is what Bowlby saw so clearly all those years ago. Attachment is not merely something we feel, it is something we become. And once we begin to see attachment in this way, Sakura's FOMO, fear of missing out no longer appears quite so amusing. It begins to look much older, much deeper, and infinitely more familiar. Perhaps every social brain, whether canine or human, spends a lifetime quietly asking the same question: where are the people who make my world feel complete? By now, Sakura has followed me through several rooms of the apartment. She has supervised at least one conversation, inspected the kitchen for developments of possible significance, and if Kaiser has wandered too close in search of affection from Dad, probably expressed her opinion with that unmistakable indignant bark, which leaves nobody in any doubt that the emotional order of the household has briefly fallen into disarray. The behavior is so familiar that it's easy to smile and move on. Yet, I often find myself wondering what is actually happening inside her brain at that very moment. For many years, we spoke rather casually about the emotional brain, almost as though it was a single place hidden somewhere beneath the cerebral cortex. Modern neuroscience paints a far richer picture. Emotion is not produced by one structure, but emerges from conversations taking place across many brain regions, each contributing something different to the experience of attachment, reward, memory, anticipation, and behavior. Take the amygdala, for example. Popular writing has unfortunately labeled it the brain's fear center, a description that has persisted despite becoming increasingly inadequate. The amygdala is better understood as a detector of significance. It continually asks one deceptively simple question: does this matter? For Sakura, few things matter more than the appearance, disappearance, or movement of Dad. The moment I rise from my chair, her brain has already begun assigning significance to that simple act. Something has changed. The world is no longer exactly what it was a moment ago. Her inner mandala has shifted and attention follows naturally. But attention alone is not enough to explain Sakura. Over years of living together, thousands of quiet moments have become woven into one another. Affection, safety, routine, companionship, shared meals, familiar voices, the reassurance of returning home, and the simple comfort of another presence have gradually become associated with a single individual. My appearance no longer represents merely a visual stimulus. It predicts something altogether richer, and the brain's reward systems awaken. At the same time, another remarkable biological process is quietly unfolding. One of the more beautiful discoveries of comparative neuroscience has been the demonstration that dogs and their humans share aspects of the same attachment chemistry. A familiar gaze, gentle touch, or affectionate interaction strengthens the bond in both species. What begins as a repeated experience gradually becomes enduring biology. Affection is not simply remembered, it becomes embedded. And let me repeat that. Affection is not simply remembered, it becomes embedded. And yet, perhaps the most fascinating part of Sakura's behavior has less to do with emotion or reward than with prediction. Increasingly, neuroscientists have begun to view the brain not simply as a machine that reacts to the world, but as one that continually predicts it. Every moment of our lives is spent constructing expectations about what is likely to happen next. Most of those times, those predictions are remarkably accurate and pass entirely unnoticed. Dad is in the study. Dad remains in the study. Dad has suddenly disappeared. The prediction has failed. The brain now has two choices. It may wait or it may gather more information. Sakura has made her preference abundantly clear. She follows not because she is incapable of independence, and not necessarily because she doubts that I shall return, but because gathering information restores certainty. The world, once again, makes sense. Her internal representation has been updated, and equilibrium quietly returns. The more I have reflected upon this, the more I have come to believe that Sakura is not simply following me. She is reducing uncertainty. That perhaps is one of the oldest tasks any brain has ever performed. It has also led me to rethink an idea that has occupied much of my own professional lives. For many years, I've spoken about what I call the brain's tug of war, the continuous negotiation between the emotional systems that propel us towards action and the frontal systems that pause, reflect, and regulate. And if this interests you, there's both a podcast on the brain's tug of war and a podcast on Luria's brain, which talk about this relationship in the brain extensively. We often imagine maturity as a triumph of restraint over impulse, reason over emotion, and the frontal brain gently calming the exuberance of the limbic system. Sakura has made me wonder whether that story is only half complete. What exactly would be gained if her frontal brain prevented her from greeting the person she loves? What wisdom would be there in suppressing the joyful sprint to the front door, the quiet companionship that follows me through the apartment, or the gentle lick on my head in the early hours of the morning? Perhaps there are moments when the emotional brain should not be restrained. Perhaps there are moments when it deserves to lead. When a parent instinctively reaches for a frightened child, when lifelong friends embrace after years apart, when tears arrive before words can be found, and when a Labrador quietly insists upon accompanying the person around whom her world has been gradually organized, these may not be failures of regulation at all. They may be among the finest expressions of what the emotional brain was designed to do. The highest achievement of the frontal brain may not always lie in suppressing emotion. Its greater wisdom may lie in recognizing when emotion has already chosen exactly the right path. Every good story deserves a counterpoint, and ours has been waiting patiently in another part of the apartment. Kaiser loves no less deeply than Sakura. He simply loves differently. If Sakura seems to ask, "Don't you need me around?" Kaiser's question is quieter and rather more restrained. "Do you need me around?" He is perfectly content to remain where he is, secure in the knowledge that our paths will cross again. He does not feel compelled to supervise every conversation, investigate every movement, or restore the emotional order of the household whenever someone else comes close to dad. His affection is present, but it does not always announce itself. His attachment appears to rest upon confidence rather than proximity. For a long time, I found myself wondering which of them had discovered the better way to love. I no longer think that is the right question. Neither temperament is superior, and neither is deficient. Sakura is attached and affectionate. Kaiser is detached and affectionate. The affection is common to both, only its expression differs. The same contrast appears repeatedly in human relationships. Some people move naturally towards those they love. Others love with greater distance and restraint. One style brings warmth, loyalty, and attentiveness. The other brings steadiness, confidence, and emotional space. Each also carries its own vulnerabilities. Every temperament, therefore, is both a gift and a vulnerability. The Sakura-like temperament may bring extraordinary loyalty, emotional availability, and sensitivity to others. Yet under stress it may become overwatchful, reassurance seeking, or exhausted by remaining continually connected. The Kaiser-like temperament may bring independence, resilience, and calm confidence. Yet, it may also miss occasions when affection needs to be made visible, when another person needs the call, the touch, or the simple reassurance that quiet loyalty has assumed was unnecessary. Do think about this. Do you see a Sakura in yourself or your loved ones? Do you see a Kaiser in yourself or your loved ones? And perhaps you'll understand them better when you've thought about it this way. Seen this way, fear of missing out is not a modern flaw so much as a very old signal. Technology did not create FOMO. It simply gave an ancient social brain many more opportunities to monitor. Beneath the modern surface lies a much older question. Am I still connected to the people and experiences that matter? Awareness matters because awareness introduces choice. The emotional brain will always make its first move. It notices, anticipates, worries, celebrates, reaches out, and follows. The frontal brain possesses a different gift. It can observe the emotional impulse without immediately obeying it. The person who repeatedly checks a message may pause and ask whether another check is truly necessary. Equally, the temperament that resembles Kaiser may discover that restraint is not always wisdom. There may be moments when quiet affection needs to become visible. Awareness allows us to preserve the gift while softening the vulnerability. And perhaps that is where neuroscience finally becomes useful. It is not there to tell us whether we should become more attached or more detached. It invites us to notice our own default settings. Once we become aware of those tendencies, we acquire choice. We remain ourselves but are no longer entirely governed by our first response. This brings us back to the generosity of childhood. Snowy was never asked to become Tigger. Piglet was never expected to acquire Pooh's ease. Tigger was never required to extinguish his enthusiasm. Cacophonics never stopped believing that one day the village might finally appreciate his music. Each belonged because each contributed something uniquely their own. Perhaps neuroscience deserves a higher calling, not simply to explain behavior, but to cultivate compassion. There is one final thought I would like to leave you. This conversation has never really been about curing FOMO, curing the fear of missing out, nor has it been about celebrating it. It has simply invited us to observe. When we recognize a little of Sakura within us, we might smile. When we recognize something of Kaiser, we might smile too. Awareness allows us to choose our response while remaining true to ourselves. As I finish recording this podcast, I know exactly what will happen. I shall stand up from my chair. Sakura will quietly rise and follow me towards the kitchen. Somewhere else in the apartment, Kaiser will lift his head, glance in my direction, and decide there is no particular urgency. Both dogs will be exactly as they have always been. And perhaps there is a lesson in that for all of us. There are many ways to love. There are many ways to belong. Every temperament tells a story. Our task is not to rewrite that story before we have understood it. It is first to observe it, then to understand it, then to accept and respect it, and finally, if greater flexibility would help us or those we love, to choose whether we wish to respond differently. Sakura and Kaiser ask nothing of us except that we observe them carefully. The rest of the journey belongs to us. Thank you for listening to me here at the Neurokrish Immersion. If you like what we do, please subscribe and share. We are on Apple, YouTube, and Spotify.